He thought she was just his secretary. She thought he barely knew her name. But one unexpected phone call, one sleepless night, and one choice changed everything. When the CEO of a multi-million-dollar firm is forced to choose between love and legacy, and when the woman who always stayed quiet suddenly becomes the only voice he hears, what would you do? Would you walk away to protect the person you love, or stay and risk losing everything you've worked for? This is not a story about wealth, power, or fairy tale romance. It's about two quiet souls who found something louder than ambition and chose each other in a world that told them not to. If you've ever been overlooked, if you've ever loved in silence, then Claire and Grant's story may feel a little like your own. Stay with us. And if this story touches your heart, leave a comment below, because someone out there might need to hear it too. At 7:15 every morning, like clockwork, Claire Whitmore arrived at the red brick building on the corner of Maple and Ash. It stood like a quiet monument in the heart of Maple Falls, Wisconsin, 3 stories of weathered charm and wooden window frames, home to one of the oldest architectural firms in the region, Whitmore and Langston Designs. She always entered through the side door, never the front, not because she had to, but because she preferred it. It was quieter there, fewer greetings, fewer eyes. Claire didn't mind being unseen. In fact, she'd grown used to it, comfortable, even. The receptionist, a young man named Tyler, would usually be finishing his bagel when she passed by, offering a polite smile that didn't expect a reply. The building creaked gently as she walked the back hallway to the break room. She would place her purse, a worn brown leather bag older than most of the interns, on the same hook she always used, then move to the corner counter and begin the day's first act of devotion, making coffee. It was never assigned to her. No one asked. But everyone expected it because Claire did it with the same quiet consistency she brought to everything else in her life. 2 pots, 1 regular, 1 decaf. She never forgot the labels. By 7:25, she was at her desk on the 2nd floor. Not the fancy offices with the glass walls upstairs. No. Her corner of the building was tucked behind the design studio, across from the file room. From there, she managed the executive calendar, fielded client correspondence, and kept a tight ship of operational sanity without anyone ever really seeing her. Claire Whitmore, age 36, unmarried, childless, dependable, forgettable. But it hadn't always been that way. Once, a long time ago. Before the silence of grief settled into her bones, Claire was the daughter of Harold Whitmore, co-founder of the firm. She used to run through those same hallways in saddle shoes, her laughter echoing off walls now covered with blueprints. Her father had taught her how to read floor plans before she learned algebra. On weekends, they would drive to empty lots where he imagined buildings. She never wanted to be an architect, but she loved the way he saw the world full of lines and light. After he passed, everything quieted. She came back to the firm, not out of ambition, but duty. A year after his funeral, she accepted an offer from the board to assist the new CEO, Grant Langston, her father's former protege and business partner's son. Claire didn't know him well. He had always been the serious one, a boy of few words even back then. Now, he ran the company, and she answered his emails. They barely spoke. Most people assumed Claire had settled for the job, the town, the solitude, but the truth was more layered than that. She had loved once. A man from Chicago, with warm hands and an easy laugh. They were engaged for 6 months. But when he asked her to leave Maple Falls behind, to start a new life in the city, she couldn't. Something rooted her here. Or maybe it was fear of change, of failure, of being seen too clearly. These days, her joys were small, measured in teaspoons, a cup of chamomile tea before bed, the satisfying click of her fountain pen on fresh paper, a worn copy of Persuasion tucked into her tote, pages folded in all the places that still made her chest ache. Claire didn't mind being invisible. Not really, but some nights, when the wind howled down Main Street and the sky turned that deep, aching indigo, she did wonder if anyone would ever look past the quiet, if anyone would ever choose her not for convenience but for her heart. That thought had been circling her mind on a particular Thursday evening, long after the others had gone home. The office was silent except for the soft hum of fluorescent lights and the distant whisper of a snow flurry brushing against the windows. She was reviewing expense reports, glasses perched low on her nose, when the phone on her desk rang. Not her cell, not the general line, her direct line, the one almost no one used. She glanced at the clock, 8:47 p.m. The display blinked EXT 301, a line from the top floor. Her fingers hovered for a moment before picking up. "This is Claire." A pause. Not the awkward kind, but one filled with breath, like someone had forgotten what to say. Then came a voice she hadn't heard like this before. "I think I called the wrong number," the man said. His voice was deep, tired, edges softened by something heavy. Maybe whiskey. Maybe regret. Claire's breath caught for a second. She knew that voice. Of course she did. It belonged to Grant Langston. In the nearly 4 years she'd worked under him, they had exchanged few words beyond meetings and memos. He was known for his precision, his unshakable calm. The man didn't stammer, didn't misdial, but here he was, calling her line past office hours, his voice sounding like it had just fallen through something hard. She could have said it was fine, that she'd redirect the call, but she didn't. She said nothing at all, and neither did he for a long, quiet moment that seemed to stretch between two people. Up on the 3rd floor, the office lights were dimmed, save for the soft glow from the corner suite that once belonged to Harold Whitmore. Now, it was Grant Langston who sat behind the wide oak desk, shoulders hunched forward, tie loosened, sleeves rolled halfway. The dark outside had long since swallowed the outlines of Maple Falls, but the town's modest skyline blinked in reflection across the large pane of glass behind him. He hadn't meant to call Claire. At least, that's what he told himself. The number he had meant to dial was his lawyer's an old friend in Chicago, the kind of man who gave advice without warmth. But somewhere between thought and movement, Grant's fingers veered. Maybe it was the scotch, maybe fatigue, or maybe it was something quieter, some instinct that told his heart it needed something more human tonight. When her voice came through, soft and measured, "This is Claire." He almost hung up. Almost. Instead, he sat there in the silence, one hand resting on the receiver, the other pinching the bridge of his nose like he could squeeze back the growing ache behind his eyes. He didn't expect her to say anything else, but then came 4 words, spoken so gently he wasn't sure they were real. "I'm still here, if you need to talk," and somehow, that unraveled him. He let out a breath, not a sigh, not frustration, just release. Like someone had cracked a window in a room he didn't know was suffocating him. "I was trying to reach my lawyer," he said, his voice low, rougher than usual, "but maybe that's not what I need tonight." A pause stretched between them, quiet but not empty. Claire sat straighter at her desk. The office around her felt suddenly different no longer, just walls and furniture, but a bridge between two people who had never shared anything more than schedules and email threads. She didn't press, didn't fill the silence. And so, Grant spoke. "It's the board," he began, his voice finding steadiness through the telling. "They've been pressuring me for weeks now to finalize a merger with North Point Design. Big firm, big money, and with that comes strings expected alliances, expected appearances, including a marriage." Claire blinked. "A marriage." He gave a dry chuckle. "Vivian Keene thinks it would solidify the merger if I married Olivia Hart, her daughter. Isn't Olivia brilliant, beautiful, and completely uninterested in me?" He finished, "Just like I am in her." Claire hesitated. "And you're considering it?" "I was," he admitted, "for the company, for my father's legacy, for the shareholders, not for me." The words landed heavy in the space between them. Claire glanced at her notebook. The page was blank, save for a doodled corner of a bookstore window she had sketched earlier that afternoon, a quiet wish from a quieter part of herself. She ran a finger over the drawing, then spoke. I used to dream of opening a bookstore, she said, surprising even herself, by the river, small, with old wooden shelves and handwritten recommendation cards. Nothing flashy, just a place for people who needed a little quiet. Grant didn't respond at first, but the silence was warm now. Not awkward. "Why didn't you?" he asked eventually. Claire's voice softened. "Because life happened. And I started believing that dreams were meant for people louder than me." He let out a breath. "That's the most honest thing anyone's said to me in months." For the next half hour, the conversation drifted, sometimes aimless, sometimes anchored in truths neither of them had dared speak aloud before. He told her about his father, a man obsessed with legacies and perception. She told him about the man she once loved who asked her to leave Maple Falls, and how she said no, even when she didn't understand why. They didn't try to solve each other. They just listened, and it was enough. At some point, the line between them felt less like a phone call and more like a thread, something fragile, but holding fast in the quiet. Then came the words Claire didn't expect. Not from him, not now. "I see you, Claire." She stilled. "I see you every morning. You wear a navy sweater on Tuesdays. You keep your pens in color order. You never take the elevator when more than 2 people are inside. You bring peppermint tea in a mason jar with a green lid." Her breath caught. He continued. "You have that notebook with the fraying spine you carry everywhere. You read during lunch breaks, sitting in the courtyard like the noise of the world can't touch you there. And, for what it's worth, you're the only real thing left in this place." Claire pressed a hand to her chest, unsure whether it was to still her heart or keep it from breaking open. She'd spent years learning how not to be noticed, how to move gently through the lives of others without leaving footprints. And yet, here he was naming every invisible part of her like it had always mattered. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked softly. "I don't know," he admitted, "but tonight it felt wrong not to." Another pause. Then, from his side, came the quiet scrape of a chair against wood. "I should let you go," he said. Claire nodded, though he couldn't see her. "Okay." But before the line clicked off, his voice returned lower now, steadier. "Good night, Claire, not Miss Whitmore, not thanks for staying late. Just Claire." And for the first time in a long, long while, that felt like being seen. Claire arrived 15 minutes earlier than usual that morning. The sun had not yet crested over the edge of Maple Falls, and the town still wore its hush like a woolen shawl. The brick building stood quiet in the soft blue hour, its windows holding on to the chill of night. Inside, the familiar scent of old paper and fresh coffee grounds greeted her like a whispered welcome. Her eyes were tired. The circles beneath them carried the weight of a night spent awake, not restless, but turned inside out by thoughts she couldn't quite name. But despite the fatigue, there was something else. Something warm. Something lit from within. She poured her coffee, steady as ever, 2 fingers deep, no cream. Then walked her usual route to the second floor. The rhythm of her heels muted on the worn carpet. Her leather bag, same as always, found its home on the chair near her desk. The small rituals held her together. She sat, opened her notebook, blank page, and then the elevator dinged. She didn't look up at first. People came and went in the mornings, the hum of routine, the murmur of greetings. But then she felt it, the pause, the stillness of someone standing just inside the doorway, not speaking. She glanced up. Grant. He stood there with his coat still on, eyes meeting hers across the space with a strange, unreadable softness. Not the sharp precision of a CEO surveying his staff, but something quieter, something that made her forget the coffee cooling in her hand. They held each other's gaze for maybe 3 seconds, but it was enough. He nodded, not curt, not formal, and disappeared into his office upstairs. Claire let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. For the rest of the morning, her fingers moved across the keyboard, but her mind lingered in that look. There had been something unspoken in it, not romantic, Not overt, just recognition. As if two people had finally found each other in a crowd of noise and tasks and years of silence. It became a quiet game between them, one no one else seemed to notice. She would leave a note on a file, not because she had to, but because she wanted to make things smoother for him. He would send back the folder with a tiny post-it on the margin. Thank you. G. When he passed her desk, which wasn't often, he always slowed, even if just for a breath. Claire began to notice the way he stirred his coffee clockwise. 3 times. Never sugar. How he paused before speaking in meetings, as if measuring the weight of his words carefully. How he looked out the window more often than he looked at people. And Grant, for his part, noticed things he had no business noticing. How she wrapped her scarf twice around her neck on cold days. How her eyes lit up just a little when she spoke with Marcy about books. How she always sat facing the same direction during lunch in the courtyard, back to the wind, book in hand, as if protecting something fragile from being swept away. They never spoke of the call, not in words, but in the spaces between them. Something had shifted, and then came the rain. It was the kind of downpour that soaked through jackets and silenced even the traffic. Claire had stayed late to finish some reports, partly because it was needed, partly because the rain gave her an excuse to stay in the quiet warmth of the building. When she finally packed up, the office was dark, save for the hallway lights on a timer. The storm clattered against the windows as she walked down the corridor, tucking her notebook under her coat. That's when she saw him. Grant was standing by her office door, not his, not the boardroom, but hers, holding something in his hand. His coat was damp at the shoulders, and his usually neat tie hung loose. He looked up, startled only for a second. "I believe this is yours," he said, voice low. In his hand was her copy of Persuasion. She hadn't even realized she'd left it, probably slipped behind the folders when she rushed out the day before. But he'd found it, and returned it, himself. She took the book from him, fingertips brushing briefly. "Thank you," she said softly. He nodded, didn't smile, didn't explain. Instead, he looked at her. Really looked, not with curiosity or polite acknowledgement, but with the same unguarded expression she'd heard in his voice over the phone. That look said everything words couldn't. "I remember. I notice. You matter." Then, without a word, he turned and walked away, footsteps fading into the hush of rain on glass. Claire stood there for a long moment, book pressed to her chest, heart louder than the storm. She returned to her desk, sat in the stillness, and opened the book, tucked inside. Between pages 121 and 122 was a small piece of paper. One sentence, written in clean, slanted handwriting she knew immediately. "Some things are worth returning to. The storm arrived just after 6. It came without warning, like so many things in life, not the kind that builds with distant thunder and slow, darkening skies, but the sudden, reckless kind. One moment, Claire was typing the last lines of a report, and the next. The windows were streaked with sheets of rain, wind pressing hard against the old glass panes of the building. Lightning cracked somewhere over Maple Falls, and then darkness. The power flickered, hesitated, then surrendered. The quiet hum of office life fell into stillness. Emergency lights kicked in, casting the hallways in a soft orange glow that made everything feel both strange and sacred. Claire stayed in her seat for a moment. Her heartbeat, once steady, had picked up, not from fear, but from the unexpected hush that followed the chaos. There was something about buildings without electricity that made people quieter too, as if the soul of the place had stepped forward, asking to be noticed. She reached for her coat, slinging her leather bag over one shoulder. It was late. Everyone had already left. Most had rushed out as soon as the weather app warned of severe winds. Claire, as always, had stayed behind. Finishing something no one asked her to finish, because that was who she was. With the elevators shut down, she made her way to the stairwell, 8 flights to descend. She pulled the heavy metal door open, feeling the temperature shift as the warm office air gave way to the cooler, cement-scented stairwell. Her heels echoed softly as she began her descent, one step at a time, And then, halfway down on the fifth-floor landing, she saw him. Grant Langston, jacket slung over one shoulder, tie loosened, sleeves rolled, looking every bit like the man she'd only seen in fragments. Until now. He turned at the sound of her footsteps. For a heartbeat, neither of them spoke. Then, quietly, he said, "Stairs it is." Claire nodded. "Seems like the universe wanted us to take the long way down." He smiled, not the polished kind, not for show, but real, worn in, tired, honest. They fell into step side by side, the echo of their steps the only sound between them at first. The stairwell was dim, lit only by sporadic emergency lights on each landing and the faint green glow of exit signs. On the fourth floor, Claire broke the silence. You'd think a building designed by architects would have a better backup generator. Grant chuckled. You'd think a company run by one would have updated it since 1994. Claire smiled at that, not at the joke, but at the fact that he let his guard down enough to make one. By the third floor, the rain was louder. It tapped against the tiny window above the landing, like 1,000 small fingers reminding them the world outside was still wild and moving. Claire spoke again, voice quieter now. "Did you always want to do this? Architecture?" Grant took a breath. "I used to love it," he said. "When I was a kid, I'd draw blueprints of tree houses I never built. In college, I designed a library for a final project that won a state award. And now," she asked. He shook his head. "Now I sign paperwork and talk to investors. I haven't designed a single building since I became CEO." They kept walking. Claire traced her hand lightly along the cool metal railing. "I used to write short stories," she said. Grant looked over. "You?" She nodded. "Nothing anyone read. Just little scenes. People in bookstores, conversations overheard at diners, happy endings no one ever saw. Why did you stop?" Claire hesitated. "Because the world needed me to be responsible. And dreams don't pay the electric bill." Grant's footsteps slowed. They stood at the second-floor landing for a moment, the air between them thick with something unspoken. Not regret, not quite sorrow, but recognition. Like two people who'd both stepped off the same path a long time ago and had forgotten how much they missed it. At the bottom of the stairs, the glass front door of the building glistened with rainwater trails. Outside, the storm raged on, but from inside, it looked almost beautiful, wind moving the trees, headlights blurred through sheets of water. Claire reached for the door, but Grant didn't move. He stood behind her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his presence, the quiet rhythm of his breathing. Then, gently, his hand brushed against hers as she lowered it from the handle. Not deliberate, not cautious, just there. His fingers lingered for a moment, not holding, not asking, just being. It was the first time he'd touched her, and it felt less like an action and more like an answer. Claire turned slightly, just enough to see him in the low light. Grant looked at her, not the way a boss looks at an employee, or a man looks at a woman in passing, but the way someone looks when the guard has finally dropped and something real has begun to breathe. He cleared his throat softly. "Would you have dinner with me this weekend?" Not a demand, not a performance, just a question wrapped in hope. Claire didn't speak right away. Instead, she smiled slow, warm, and full of something that had been asleep inside her for a long, long time. She didn't need to say yes. Not yet. But the smile said enough. Saturday came with a gentle sky, the kind that didn't promise anything extravagant, but offered something quieter, a softness, a space to breathe. Claire stood by the front window of her cottage, sweater sleeves pulled over her hands, watching leaves tumble in the breeze along Maple Street. She hadn't told anyone about the dinner, not Marcy, not even herself, not out loud, at least, but in her chest, something had been shifting all day, like the way the lake swells just before dawn breaks over the water. At 6:04 p.m., a pickup truck pulled into her gravel driveway. Not the company vehicle, not the black sedan she'd seen Grant step out of for board meetings and investor calls. This was an old, well-kept Ford. Paint a little faded, a dent near the rear bumper. Personal, quiet, real. Claire opened the door before he could knock. Grant stood there in jeans and a gray flannel shirt, sleeves rolled, hair slightly tousled from the wind. His smile was shy, not the kind she'd seen in press releases or office gatherings. This one had edges, like it had been tucked away too long. "Evening," he said. "Hi," she replied, stepping out and locking the door behind her. The evening air was cool, not cold, and carried the scent of pine and early autumn. He opened the truck door for her. They didn't speak much at first. The road to the lake was familiar, winding past old barns and golden fields. Claire looked out the window, watching the world blur into warm-toned memories. He pulled into a small lot near the edge of the lake, beside a diner that looked like it hadn't changed in 50 years. Wooden siding, red neon open sign blinking softly. Inside, it smelled of coffee, melted cheese, and the kind of stories that come from booths and paper napkins. "This place," Grant began as he held the door open for her. "I used to come here with my mom. She'd order grilled cheese and pretend it was fine dining." Claire smiled. "Sounds like the kind of place worth keeping." They slid into a booth by the window. The lake shimmered beyond the glass, catching the last traces of daylight. Their menus sat untouched. Somehow, neither felt the need to pretend the food was the reason they were there. He ordered black coffee. She chose tea with honey. And then, slowly, as if the low hum of the place made it safe, they began to talk. About childhood. Grant told her how his mother raised him alone after his father left, how every achievement felt like a debt he could never fully repay. He spoke of scholarships, early mornings, and the pressure to always appear fine. His voice never broke, but his fingers traced the rim of his coffee cup like someone trying to stay steady. Claire listened. She didn't interrupt. She knew the ache of pretending. She'd worn that same mask too many times. When he paused, she told him about the man who once asked her to marry him, a kind man, steady and dependable. But when he'd opened the ring box, Claire had felt nothing, just a quiet panic in her chest, like she was being gently ushered toward a life that didn't quite belong to her. "I think I was more in love with the idea of being in love," she said. "But when the moment came, I realized I hadn't even let myself be seen yet. Not really." Grant nodded. People fall in love with what they think they know, not always with the person underneath. He looked out the window for a moment, then back at her. Everyone's always loved the name Langston, the legacy, the empire, but I don't think anyone's ever loved the man behind it. There was no self-pity in his voice, just exhaustion. The quiet kind that builds over years of being admired, but never truly known. Claire reached for her tea. The cup was warm against her palms. "You don't have to be your name," she said gently. "You get to be who you are, not just who the world wants you to be." They ate slowly, not because the food demanded it, but because neither wanted the night to end. Stories passed between them like fireflies, little flickers of light that had once been tucked away. After dinner, they stepped outside into the cool night air. The lake was calm now. The storm from days before had washed the sky clean. Stars blinked overhead, quiet and unassuming. He walked her to the passenger side, but didn't open the door right away. Instead, they stood there, two people in the soft silence of a gravel parking lot, shadows stretching long under the moonlight. Claire looked up at him, heart steady now. She didn't feel nervous, not exactly. What she felt was present. Grant looked at her, hands in his pockets. He didn't reach for her, didn't try to close the space between them, but his eyes, they held something else, something deeper, an invitation, a respect, a promise. Claire stepped forward, just slightly, close enough that their hands brushed. She turned hers upward, palm open, and let her fingers touch his. It was nothing dramatic, no sweeping music, no sudden kiss, just contact, real, bare, and true. He let out a soft breath, one he may not have realized he'd been holding, and she smiled, slow, tender. No words. They didn't need them. He opened the door for her then, and she slid into the seat. The drive back was quiet, filled with the kind of silence that feels like a song waiting to be written. When he dropped her off, he didn't ask to come. She replied, good night, Grant, and he didn't linger, just looked at her and said, good night, Claire. Inside, the house felt different, not smaller, not lonelier, just paused. Claire kicked off her shoes, poured a glass of water, and sat at her desk by the window. She reached for her old journal, the leather one with creases along the spine, tucked away too long. She opened to a blank page, and, for the first time in years, she wrote the first line of something new. Monday morning arrived with a kind of softness Claire hadn't felt in a long time. The sky over Maple Falls was the color of pearl pale, quiet, undecided, the kind of sky that didn't try to impress, just offered its presence gently, like a friend sitting beside you in silence. Claire stepped out of her cottage wearing a coat the same deep brown as her eyes, a soft scarf tucked close to her neck. Her hands trembled slightly, not from cold, but from something else, something lighter, unfamiliar, like hope wearing a new face. She arrived at the office 15 minutes earlier than usual, not for deadlines, not because anyone asked her to, but because she needed to. The halls were mostly empty, the scent of fresh coffee drifting from the communal kitchen like a quiet invitation. She filled her mug and took the long way to her desk, the path that passed the windows, just in case. And there he was, Grant, crossing the marble lobby with his usual purposeful stride, but slower now, as if noticing things he hadn't before, as if noticing her. Their eyes met for a moment too long to be called casual. No smile, no wave, just a pause, and a knowing. Claire turned the corner, heart steadying itself against her ribs like a bird relearning how to fly. The next few days unfolded like a story told in subtle brushstrokes. She would pass him in the elevator lobby, both pretending to look at their phones, yet somehow always noticing what the other was wearing. He would arrive at the office through a different entrance now, the one that just happened to take him past the cluster of assistant desks near Claire's corner. He'd stop to speak with someone about a logistics update, a blueprint revision, but his eyes would drift. She never lingered, never followed, but she felt it, his presence, a little closer each day. It wasn't a secret, but it wasn't spoken, and somehow that made it more theirs. Marcy noticed first. Claire was sipping tea at her desk, eyes drifting out the window at the sugar maples turning burnt red, when Marcy leaned in from the neighboring cubicle. "You've got that look," Marcy said, voice low and playful. Claire blinked. "What?" Look, Marcy raised an eyebrow. "The kind you see on women in old romance novels, like someone who's not walking alone anymore." Claire smiled, caught off guard by the truth in it. "I don't know what you're talking about," she murmured, but she didn't deny it. Marcy gave her a look that said, "Sure you don't," then returned to her email, as if the whole world hadn't just shifted on its axis. One afternoon, Claire found herself rearranging the books on the small shelf behind her desk. It wasn't necessary. No one else even noticed the titles. But she did. And suddenly, she wanted things to feel right. She placed her worn copy of Persuasion where the spine faced out. It was the one novel she always returned to. The quiet ache of missed chances, of love that waited patiently, had always spoken to her. And now, it whispered louder than ever. That same day, she caught Grant watching her through the glass conference room wall, not overtly, just a glance as he stepped away from the whiteboard during a strategy meeting. Their eyes met again, still, no words. But the space between them, even across that room, even with people talking around him, felt full. Friday brought crisp air and light that poured gold across the office floor like spilled sunlight. Claire stood by the third-floor window during lunch, her sandwich untouched. The city of Maple Falls spread before her in autumn hues. Trees flamed orange and crimson along the sidewalks. Leaves danced on the breeze, brushing car hoods and window ledges like children playing tag. Behind her, the office hummed with keyboards and muted conversation. But where she stood, it was quiet. She wrapped her arms around herself, not for warmth, but to hold something steady inside, something fragile and glowing. She didn't know where this was going, didn't dare give it a name, but it was real, and it was happening. That evening, as most of the staff filed out in coats and scarves, Claire lingered. She moved slowly, like time didn't matter. As she turned off her desk lamp, a shadow passed the frosted glass of her office door. Her heart caught not in fear, but anticipation. It was Grant. He didn't knock, just walked past, eyes forward, but slowing ever so slightly when he reached her door. She watched him go, the same way she watched the leaves outside, as something beautiful that didn't ask to be owned, only noticed later. As she walked to her car under a sky that had darkened to ink, Claire thought of all the conversations they hadn't had, and all the ones they had shared without saying a word. She realized some connections didn't begin with declarations or dramatic moments. Sometimes, they started in the quiet, in the glance held a second longer, in the coffee stirred at the same time, in the silence between two hearts brave enough to sit still. Back home. Claire slipped off her shoes, lit a candle by the kitchen window, and brewed a pot of chamomile. She opened her journal again, the one where she'd written the first chapter days ago. This time, she didn't need to search for a sentence. It came easily. There was once a woman who spent most of her life being overlooked until the silence she had always feared became the place she was finally seen. Rumors, like smoke, never need a spark to start just a single shift in the air. And in the halls of Whitmore and Langston Designs, the air had started to change. It began quietly, as these things always do. A pause in conversation when Claire entered the room. A glance exchanged too quickly between two assistants. The way Russell Dean, the CFO, started showing up in meetings he normally ignored, with eyes that scanned Claire longer than necessary. Claire felt it before she knew it. People had started to look at her differently, not unkind, not overt, but the way someone might glance at a puzzle they hadn't noticed was missing a piece and suddenly weren't sure where it went. She tried to brush it off at first. People always made up stories when the day got too long and the coffee too cold. But then came the email from Vivian Keene, the firm's largest shareholder, asking for a private conversation with Grant. Claire wasn't supposed to know, but people talk, and whispers, once loosed, have a way of growing teeth. Russell Dean had never liked Claire. Not really. She couldn't say why. Perhaps it was because she didn't laugh at his jokes during meetings, or because she wasn't dazzled by his vacation stories to Montecito or Maui. Or maybe it was simpler. He had once applied for a promotion that went to someone else, and assumed Claire had something to do with it. He was the kind of man who measured respect in corner offices and titles on email signatures. And Claire. She had none of those, just a quiet desk, and the attention of a man Russell had spent 10 years trying to impress. That was enough. It started with small comments in the break room. I hear Grant's been working late a lot lately. Wonder who keeps him company. You know she's never dated anyone from the office before, but maybe she's making exceptions. No names, just suggestions, but in a place where reputations were built over coffee runs and shared elevators. Suggestions were enough. Claire felt it most in the eyes. People who used to nod now just looked. Not with interest, but with calculation. As if trying to answer a question they were too polite to ask. The weekly strategy meeting came on a Thursday, overcast and brittle with tension. Claire sat at the far end of the table, her notepad open, pen poised. She had taken notes in that room for almost 6 years, never drawing attention, never speaking out of turn. But that day felt different. Russell was at the head of the table, filling in for Grant, who was on a client call. His voice was crisp, practiced, the kind that sounded confident until you listened closely. Then came the moment. He was discussing team restructuring, budgets, new project assignments, and, of course, he said, eyes flicking toward Claire with something sharp behind them. We'll want to ensure all internal movements are based on professional merit, not, shall we say, personal connections. The words hung in the air like a slap no one dared respond to. He hadn't said her name. He hadn't needed to. Everyone in that room knew. Claire froze. Her fingers tightened around the pen so hard the plastic creaked. Her heart hammered in her ears, but she kept her gaze down, not trusting her voice or her tears. She wrote one line in her notebook, though she didn't know why. They think I've been bought, when all I ever wanted was to be seen. She made it through the rest of the meeting in silence. No one came to her afterward. No one said anything, not even Marcy, who only gave her a long, aching look as they passed in the hallway. And Claire. She walked straight to the women's restroom, locked the farthest stall, and sat down without moving, not crying, just sitting. The silence felt different now, not peaceful, not shared, just alone. That night, she sat on her porch long after the porch light had flickered on. The town around her was quiet, the kind of quiet unique to small towns after 9 p.m., where everyone has gone home and the world shrinks to porch steps and warm cups of tea. She hadn't made tea tonight, just sat, arms wrapped around her knees, jacket zipped to her chin, and then headlights. She knew the truck before it even pulled into the driveway. The old Ford, the one that always surprised her that a man with everything would choose something so simple. Grant stepped out. His face was drawn, not just tired, but worn, like someone who had spent all day trying to hold something together with hands that kept slipping. He didn't say anything right away, just walked up the steps and stood in front of her. The air between them felt dense, not with awkwardness, but with the weight of everything unsaid. Finally, he spoke. His voice was low, and rougher than she'd ever heard it. "We need to talk." The moment he sat down on the edge of her porch swing, Claire already knew what was coming. There was something in the way Grant looked at her, not with distance, but with the heavy tenderness of someone about to hurt the one person they had sworn not to. He didn't touch her. Just let the wooden swing creak softly between them as the quiet evening folded in. Maple Falls was still. The late autumn air held a chill that sank into the bones, but Claire didn't move to grab the blanket beside her. Her fingers curled around the hem of her sweater instead, grounding herself in something, anything. Grant cleared his throat, the kind of throat clear a man does when he needs time to find the least painful version of the truth. "They met with me today," he said softly. His voice wasn't cold, just careful. Claire didn't ask who they were. She already knew. Vivian Keene, the board, Russell Dean, no doubt in the background, offering concerns with polite venom. "They're asking me to step back," Grant said, "not from the company, but from you." The words landed with a soft cruelty. No raised voices, no dramatics, just a truth sharp enough to slice between them. Claire looked straight ahead, not at him. Not yet. She let out a slow breath, watched it fog in the air, then disappear. "They think we're a liability," she said quietly. He didn't answer, but his silence confirmed it. It would have been easier if either of them had denied what they were feeling. If it had all been a misunderstanding, a momentary connection misread and misreturned, but they both knew it wasn't, and that made it harder, because now, love wasn't the problem. The world around it was. Claire turned to him then, not with anger, but with something deeper, a kind of calm sadness that only came when you'd already walked through the storm and stood in its aftermath. "Maybe," she said softly, "we pause, for your sake." The words came out steady, practiced, almost, but Grant's head jerked slightly, like the suggestion surprised him, or maybe hurt him more than he expected. "You don't have to protect me, Claire," he murmured, but she did. Not because she didn't love him, but because she did. And sometimes, the most selfless thing love can do is step back. They didn't call it a breakup. There was no dramatic ending, no slammed doors or ultimatums, just an agreement between two people trying to do the right thing in a world that punished softness. The days that followed returned to routine, at least on the surface. Claire went back to her 7:15 coffee ritual. Black, no sugar. She smiled politely in morning meetings, kept her notepad full of careful shorthand, and responded to emails within the hour. But something had shifted. She could feel it in the way her own laughter sounded just a little too forced, in the way she paused at the elevator each morning, waiting one extra beat before stepping in, hoping then not hoping to see him walk through the front doors. Grant kept his distance. She noticed. Of course she did. Not out of cruelty, but out of respect, perhaps. He stopped walking past her office, stopped lingering near the break room. It was like they had both silently agreed to disappear from each other's routines, the only way to keep the story from writing its own headline. Claire found herself walking longer in the afternoons. Leash in one hand, coffee in the other. She let her golden retriever, Daisy, guide her through the winding trails behind her neighborhood. The park was quieter now, leaves blanketing the grass. The lake glazed in a thin shimmer of wind. She watched couples walk hand in hand, teenagers laughing at nothing, old men feeding ducks by the pond, and in all of it, she felt apart, not alone, just misplaced, like someone who had been part of a story but had turned to the wrong page. That weekend, she sat in her living room surrounded by pages of a manuscript she hadn't touched in weeks. Her novel, the one she'd dreamed of finishing for years. Now, the words felt like strangers. The characters, lifeless. The love story she'd once believed in, unconvincing. In a quiet fit of something not rage, not despair, just emptiness, she gathered the pages, all 147 of them, and walked out to the small fire pit in her backyard. She didn't cry, just watched the flames catch. The paper curled, blackened, disappeared. Smoke rose into the night sky, carrying pieces of her dream into the stars. On Monday morning, Claire arrived at the office before sunrise. No one else was there, just the humming of the old heater and the soft tap of her boots on the tile floor. She sat at her desk, the same desk she had used for years, same pencil cup, same framed photo of her parents on a sailboat in Maine, but something was different. There was an envelope resting in the center of the desk. No name, no seal, just one line, handwritten in black ink clean, elegant, familiar. Don't stop writing. Gee, Claire's breath caught in her throat. She touched the paper like it might dissolve beneath her fingertips. Then slowly, she smiled. Not the smile of someone who had everything figured out, but the smile of someone who had just been reminded. She still had something worth fighting for. The hardest part of love isn't losing it, it's pretending it never happened. The days grew shorter in Maple Falls, but the silence inside the office stretched even longer. Claire sat at her desk, same as always, spine straight, fingers typing notes with mechanical grace. From the outside, nothing had changed, but inside, something hollow had settled in her chest, like winter had arrived early and taken up residence right behind her ribs. Grant passed by her office most mornings, not slowly, not quickly, just with a precision that made it clear he knew exactly where her desk was and exactly where his eyes shouldn't land. But they did, for the briefest moments, a flicker, a glance, a heartbeat that hesitated in both their throats before returning to rhythm. It had been nearly 5 weeks. 5 weeks of silence. Of clipped email exchanges, of meetings where their voices never overlapped, of pretending that the most honest conversation either had ever shared hadn't happened in a stairwell, during a storm, with only the sound of rain to bear witness. Marcy noticed. Of course she did. One afternoon, she pulled Claire into the break room under the guise of reorganizing the tea shelf, which everyone knew was code for heart-to-heart incoming. "You look exhausted," she said, gently but firmly. Claire offered a tired smile, the kind that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm fine." "You're not," Marcy replied, leaning back against the counter. "And I say this with love. Claire, but maybe it's time you stepped away. Take some time off, go see your sister in Vermont, or finally take that weekend writing retreat you've always talked about." Claire shook her head. Leaving would feel like Running? Sometimes, Marcy said, her voice softer now. Running is what keeps you alive. But Claire stayed. She wasn't sure if it was pride or love or some tangled mixture of both. But each morning, she still showed up, still brewed the first pot of coffee at 7:15, still organized the files no one else noticed were disorganized, still hoped foolishly, quietly, that maybe this day would be different. It never was. And then came the meeting. Vivian Keene stood at the head of the long conference table, her pearls perfectly aligned, voice clipped and practiced. "We've received a favorable proposal from Bridge and Harper Group," she announced. "A merger that would not only stabilize our long-term assets, but bring in capital from international investors." Claire felt the shift in the room instantly. Words like merge and acquire didn't just mean numbers. They meant control, power, influence. Grant sat 2 chairs away from Vivian, expression unreadable. But Claire had spent enough time watching him, from years of quiet admiration to the aching closeness they once shared, to know that his stillness wasn't calm. It was restraint. "If the board moves forward," Vivian continued, "Mr. Langston's voting shares will be diluted. He would remain in an advisory role, but leadership would transition under a joint CEO structure. In other words, he would be out." Claire's throat tightened. She wanted to speak, but there was nothing she could say. Not here, not anymore. 2 days later, the world broke open. It started with a headline on the Maple Falls Gazette's website: "Local CEO entangled in office romance scandal amid merger talks below it." A blurry photo of Claire from the side, taken months ago, on the steps outside the company building, coffee in one hand, Grant's shadow just behind her. The article cited anonymous internal emails suggesting an inappropriate relationship between Grant Langston and a female subordinate. No names were officially mentioned, but anyone who worked at Whitmore and Langston knew. There was only one person that could be. Claire found out about it the way most people find out bad news these days, from a ping on her phone. Marcy sent a single word: "Don't look." But Claire looked anyway. The screen glowed with the headline, and her name, not printed, but implied, screamed louder than anything she'd ever heard. She sat frozen on the worn brown sofa in her living room. Daisy curled beside her. The TV played on in the background, the local news station running a developing story segment. Her photo again. Grant's name, clear this time. Stock photos of the company building. A slow, creeping disbelief spread through her limbs. This wasn't her life. This was a bad movie playing out in slow motion, and somehow, she was both the audience and the protagonist, powerless to stop the reel from spinning. Her phone rang. She didn't answer. Not Grant, not Marcy, not even her sister, who left a voicemail saying, "You should come home. Claire, this isn't fair to you." But what was fair anymore? She had loved quietly, carefully, had done nothing wrong but fall for someone whose name came with too much weight. And now, she was a scandal, a headline, a distraction. That night, she didn't sleep. She just sat on her porch with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, watching the stars try to pierce through the thick Wisconsin clouds. She thought of Grant, of how he had looked at her the night they met in the stairwell, not like a boss, or a man with an empire, but like someone seen. And now, the whole world saw them both. But not the truth, just the version twisted for clicks. The wind picked up, rustling the last of the brittle leaves still clinging to the trees. They whispered against the siding of the house like ghosts trying to speak. Claire closed her eyes. She would show up tomorrow. She would keep showing up, because someone had to remind them all that this noise, this storm didn't get to define her. She had a story of her own, and she wasn't done telling it. The morning sun barely pierced through the clouds over Maple Falls, casting a gray hush over the building that once felt like a second home to Claire. But today, it felt like a courthouse. By 9:00 a.m., every member of the Whitmore and Langston board had been summoned. The top-floor conference room, with its long mahogany table and tall windows, now bristled with unspoken judgments. Silver briefcases clicked open. Whispered conversations danced like dry leaves across a stone path. At the far end, Vivian Keene sat in her usual chair, spine straight as steel. To her right, Russell Dean smirked in that way Claire had come to dread, like a man already tasting victory before the game had begun. Claire sat quietly near the far wall. She wasn't supposed to be in this room. Normally, she'd be taking notes outside, maybe bringing in coffee. Today, her hands rested on her lap, trembling slightly, the tips of her fingers cold. She almost didn't come, almost let Grant face this alone. But then she remembered the note he left on her desk, the one that read, "This time, we stand together." At exactly 9:07, the door opened. Grant Langston walked in, not in his usual navy suit. No, today he wore a charcoal gray jacket, no tie, top button undone. His face was calm, but not relaxed. It carried the weight of a man who had already made a decision he knew would cost him. Under one arm, he held a manila folder. In the other, nothing. At least, not yet. He walked to the head of the table. "Thank you all for coming," he said, voice steady. "I know there's been noise, questions, speculation," Vivian interjected, sharp as a blade, "and damage to this company's reputation." He nodded. "Yes, and that's exactly why I called this meeting. Not to defend rumors, but to clarify truths." He laid the folder down in front of him. Claire recognized the logo on it. It was the restructuring plan. She had helped him organize those notes weeks ago, before the silence, before everything cracked open. But instead of opening it, Grant gently pushed the folder aside. Then, slowly, deliberately, he walked the few steps across the room and took Claire's hand in his. Gasps rippled through the room like a wave hitting rock. He didn't let go. "I've spent the last 10 years trying to be the man this company expected me to be," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "The man my father would have wanted. The kind of man who doesn't flinch, doesn't feel, only builds, only profits." He looked down at Claire for a moment, then back at the board. "But somewhere along the way, I forgot that this company was built not just with blueprints and steel, but with people who care. People who stay late and show up early. People like Claire Whitmore." Vivian scoffed. "Is this your defense?" Grant. "Declaring your affections in a boardroom while the company bleeds credibility?" Grant turned to her. "No. Vivian, this isn't a defense. It's a declaration." A pause. "Then I'm rejecting the merger." Dead silence. "And I'm resigning as CEO, effective immediately." Claire felt the breath leave her lungs. She squeezed his hand, but he didn't look at her, not yet. Russell stood. "You're walking away from the company your father built." Grant turned slowly toward him. "No. I'm walking toward the life I never thought I was allowed to have." Then he finally turned to Claire. Time slowed. The entire boardroom fell away. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a small black velvet box worn at the corners, like it had been carried for too long by someone unsure if he'd ever be brave enough to use it. He opened it, inside a simple silver band, understated and honest, like her. "Claire Whitmore," he said, his voice cracking slightly for the first time that morning. "I have no title to offer you now. No office, no empire, just me. A man who spent too long pretending success could replace love." He knelt right there, on the polished hardwood floor, among the shocked stares and whispers and judgment. "But if you'll have me, I want to build something real. With you. Starting now." Claire didn't speak at first. She just looked at him, at the man who used to live behind glass walls and marble desks, now kneeling before her with nothing but truth. Her hand trembled as she reached for the ring. She didn't say yes, didn't have to. She simply nodded, once, then twice, tears sliding down her cheeks in quiet surrender. Grant slipped the ring onto her finger. Behind them, the boardroom murmured into life. Russell standing again. Vivian already pulling out her phone, no doubt preparing a statement for the press. But for Claire and Grant, the world narrowed to the few inches between their hands. He stood, pulled her into a hug, not one of passion or possession, but of coming home. "I'm sorry it had to be like this," he whispered into her hair. Claire shook her head against his chest. "It had to be like this," she replied, "or we'd never be free." And in that strange, sterile room, where power had always been currency, something unspoken shifted, not a victory, not yet, but a beginning. Sometimes, the biggest changes begin with quiet goodbyes. There was no big farewell party, no catered lunch, no balloons, just a cool wind rustling the maple leaves outside the building, where Claire Whitmore had spent the better part of her adult life, and a stack of manila folders tucked neatly into her worn leather bag, the same one she'd carried on her first day, 12 years ago. That morning, she arrived early, earlier than anyone else, as always. The office lights flickered on slowly as she walked through the quiet space. Desks sat empty. Mugs with familiar names lined the counter in the break room. The elevator pinged softly in the distance, and she almost turned to look, a habit she hadn't shaken since Grant first started walking past her desk with slower steps. But this morning, there was no rush, no pretending, just closure. Her resignation letter had been submitted the night before, short, grateful, honest. It wasn't about scandal or shame. It wasn't even about pain. It was about something deeper, the quiet realization that her time here had served its purpose. Later that afternoon, she met Grant on the top floor, the very office where this strange story had truly begun, not with a kiss or a touch, but a misplaced phone call that had felt more like fate than accident. He was already there, standing by the window, looking out over Maple Falls as though memorizing it. He wore jeans, a charcoal sweater, no tie. No title, just Grant. On the desk behind him were 2 cardboard boxes, one labeled "to keep," the other "to let go." Claire smiled at the simplicity of it. The elegance of a man who'd once ruled meetings with silence and steel, now dividing his legacy into 2 piles with his own hands. "You ready?" she asked. He turned, his smile soft. "As I'll ever be." They didn't speak much as they walked through the building one last time. Claire stopped at her desk. She ran her hand across the surface, tracing the faint circular stain from years of coffee cups. The space was empty now, but it still smelled faintly of lavender hand cream and paper ink. Grant waited patiently beside her. When they reached the front doors, Claire glanced back once more, not with longing, not even with nostalgia, just with respect. Every hallway, every meeting room, every sigh and late night, it had shaped her, not defined her, but shaped her. She reached for the door. Grant's fingers brushed hers, and without a word, he laced his hand in hers, side by side. They walked out. The autumn air kissed her cheeks as they stepped outside. Trees shivered with color amber, crimson, gold, as if the town itself was clapping softly for them. Claire looked up at the building one last time, not as a place that held her back, but as the place she finally chose to walk away from. The day faded gently into evening. Claire spent it cleaning out old drawers, recycling stacks of journals filled with meeting notes and unspoken dreams. Her dog, Huck, lay curled by the couch, eyes following her with calm devotion. She made a cup of peppermint tea, the way she always did on uncertain nights. The house was quiet, but it didn't feel lonely, just still. She moved to the kitchen window and pulled aside the curtain. A gust of wind lifted the edges of the porch swing's cushion, and then she saw him. Grant was sitting on the front steps of her porch. He didn't knock, didn't text. He just sat, legs stretched out, jacket unzipped, and Huck's graying head resting comfortably in his lap. The porch light above cast a golden hue across his face, softening the hard lines carved by years of expectation. In that light, he didn't look like a former CEO or a man who'd walked away from an empire. He looked like someone who finally knew what mattered. Claire opened the door slowly. He looked up. "I didn't mean to intrude," he said gently. "Huck and I had a long talk. He said I should stay." Claire smiled. He's a good judge of character." Grant rubbed behind the dog's ears. "Yeah. He said I'm a little rough around the edges, but teachable." She stepped outside, wrapping her sweater a little tighter. He shifted to make room beside him, and she sat, their shoulders almost touching. No words for a while. Just the wind, the creak of the swing, the kind of silence that doesn't demand to be filled. Finally, Grant spoke. "I don't know what comes next," he said quietly. "I don't have a 5-year plan, or a vision board, or a speech." Claire didn't reply right away. She watched the leaves fall one by one, landing gently on the porch steps like soft punctuation marks to a season ending. Then he added, "But I know I want every mile of it to be with you." She looked at him, not startled, not overwhelmed, just seen. All the years of being overlooked, passed by, considered part of the background, they melted away in that moment. Not because someone finally noticed her, but because someone saw her, all of her. She didn't say yes. She didn't have to. She reached down, lifted Huck into her lap, and leaned gently against Grant's shoulder. And they sat like that. 3 souls on a porch, under a warm light, on the edge of something neither of them had words for yet. The little blue and white sign hung quietly above the glass door, swaying ever so slightly in the riverside breeze. The quiet chapter. 3 simple words. But for Claire Whitmore, it was a declaration, a promise, a beginning. It had taken 3 months of sanding, painting, planning, doubting, and trying again. But here it was, her bookstore tucked beneath the sprawling oaks along Maple River, right where the old post office used to stand. It smelled like fresh wood, old pages, and new chances. Inside, the shelves still bore the faint fingerprints of Grant Langston. He had been there for every nail, every crooked plank, every frustrated sigh. The man who once signed billion-dollar contracts had stood barefoot on a tarp with a paint roller, splattered in sage green, grinning like a boy who'd just built his first treehouse. And, maybe, in a way, he had. Claire stood behind the small wooden counter that morning, watching the sun creep across the front window, lighting up the stack of hand-labeled bookmarks she'd spent last night cutting and punching herself. Her fingers traced the edge of one. Every story matters. A woman stepped in, the doorbell chiming softly. She wore a floral cardigan and pushed a walker with tennis balls on the legs. Behind her, a retired school teacher with thick glasses and silver curls. By 10 o'clock, a half-dozen women had gathered in the reading nook near the back. Nestled on mismatched armchairs Claire had rescued from a church thrift sale. The kettle hissed gently behind the counter. Sugar cookies sat on a plate no one touched just yet, not until the first sentence was read aloud. Claire stood with a paperback in hand, her voice trembling slightly. "I thought we'd start with something comforting." She smiled. Jane Austen never disappoints. A few heads nodded. And, as she began to read, the familiar cadence of Sense and Sensibility filling the room, something unlocked. In her voice, in their eyes, in the space between. Not everyone understood what a bookstore could be. But these women did, because they, too, had once felt invisible. Every afternoon, Grant stopped by, not in a suit, not in a rush, just as himself sometimes with lunch in hand, sometimes just to tighten a loose hinge or change a light bulb Claire didn't have the reach for. "Do you miss it?" she asked him one day, watching him crouch to screw in a new bracket under the poetry shelf. He looked up, thoughtful. The board meetings? No. The espresso machine in the executive lounge? A little. They both laughed. But no. He added, "What I missed was this, doing something real. With my hands, with my heart." Claire didn't say anything, just handed him a glass of lemonade. And for a moment, they stood side by side, watching the river ripple past the window. One rainy Thursday afternoon, Claire decided to reorganize the donation shelf in the back room. The box was dusty, filled with books her father had once collected, architectural history, design theory, and a few worn paperbacks from the 60s. She flipped through them absently, her fingers catching on something wedged between two covers. A sealed envelope, yellowed, stamped, but never mailed. Her name was on the front in her father's neat, serif handwriting. Claire. Her heart caught in her chest. Hands trembling, she opened it slowly, the paper crackling like dry leaves. The letter was short. Claire Bear. I know you may never read this, or maybe by the time you do, I'll be long gone. But I need you to know something. You see the world differently. Quieter, maybe, but deeper, too. Don't let anyone make you feel small for that. Whatever you do, whether you keep books, build homes, or raise children, do it with truth. And if you ever write again, don't write what you think people want to hear. Write what you know is real. Write what matters to you. Love, always, Dad. Claire read it 3 times. She sat there on the wooden floor, the letter folded on her lap, the rain tapping softly against the window above. She thought of the manuscript she'd burned in a fit of hopelessness months ago. She thought of the journal she'd filled at 16, the one with a picture of a bookstore pasted onto the inside cover. And she thought of every woman who had ever stepped into this space and finally felt seen. That night, after locking up, Claire didn't go home right away. She made herself a cup of peppermint tea, the same blend her mother used to steep on snowy evenings. She turned on the soft lamp in the corner and opened her laptop at the front counter. The cursor blinked against a white page. She placed the letter beside her and began. Chapter 1. It wasn't poetic, it wasn't perfect, but it was hers. She didn't write for a publisher. She didn't write for a market trend. H.S.E. wrote because the story was waiting, inside her, quietly, patiently. The old garden behind Grant's cottage had been neglected for years. Overgrown vines clung to the rusted wire fence. Daisies bloomed where tomatoes once grew, and the small wooden shed leaned tiredly to one side, as if trying to rest its weight on memories that had long faded. But Grant liked it that way. Not perfect, just honest. He spent his mornings there now, hands in the soil, learning the language of roots and rhythms, lettuce, basil, cherry tomatoes, nothing fancy, but they grew quietly, steadily under his care. And in tending to them, something inside him softened. It wasn't that he missed being a CEO. He missed the clarity the way decisions used to be bullet points on a slide. But now, he was learning the value of uncertainty, of not having every answer, of listening more than speaking. Some days, he cooked real cooking, not microwave reheats in executive lounges. He made slow stews, sourdough that failed twice before rising, and lemon bars using Claire's mother's recipe. He visited friends, helped fix up their fences, gave advice to a cousin trying to launch a small home renovation business. But the part of his day that made him feel most himself was from 6:11 to 7:15 p.m. on Tuesdays and Thursdays when he taught Introduction to Architectural Drawing at the Maple Falls Community Center. The class was small, a retired carpenter, a teenage girl who hated math but loved lines, a widower who'd always dreamed of building birdhouses. Grant would walk into the room with rolled-up graph paper under one arm and a box of stubby pencils under the other. He no longer needed to be important. He just wanted to be useful. Claire's world, meanwhile, unfolded quietly down by the river. The bookstore had become more than a shop. It had become a rhythm in the town's heartbeat. People came not just for books, but for belonging. A woman who just lost her husband would sit in the poetry corner, sipping tea in silence. A shy teenager would leave folded poems between pages of old anthologies. A retired teacher would bring in homemade cookies on Fridays. And Claire. She remembered every name, every birthday, every grief. They didn't call her Ms. Whitmore anymore, just Claire, the woman who remembered your favorite author, who'd hold your hand for a moment longer, who never made you feel rushed. At night, Grant would often come by after locking up his garden shed. He'd find her in the shop's reading nook, curled on the worn leather chair, laptop on her lap, writing, not for an agent, not for a publisher, just because the words were finally coming back. She was on chapter 7 of a story she hadn't yet named. But it felt less like a book and more like a long-held breath. Finally released. They didn't talk much about what they were. No declarations, no timelines, no pressure. He'd bring her tea. She'd rest her head on his shoulder while he read. And in that kind of love, soft, slow, without audience, they both found something neither had expected. Not passion, but peace. One Saturday morning, Claire was organizing the shelf labeled Donated Treasures when the little bell above the door chimed. A woman in her 70s stepped in, her hair in tight gray curls, a soft mauve scarf around her neck. Claire smiled and walked over. Looking for anything special today, she asked gently. The woman blinked back emotion. Yes, she said. You... Claire paused. I'm sorry. The woman stepped closer. Her voice trembled. I've been sick. Still am, really. But my daughter brings me here. Says this place helps her more than the hospital waiting rooms ever could. She took Claire's hand. I don't know what it is you're doing here, but your story saved me. Claire stood still, heart suddenly loud in her ears. I haven't published anything, she whispered, almost apologetically. The woman smiled softly. Oh, I'm not talking about a book. Honey, I mean you. How you live, how you remember my name, how you sit with my daughter when I'm too tired to come in. She squeezed Claire's hand. Some lives are books we get to read with our eyes open. Thank you for letting us read yours. Claire's throat tightened. She reached out and wrapped her arms gently around the woman, holding her as though she might vanish if she let go too soon. She didn't say anything, didn't need to. Later that evening, long after the last customer had left and the shop lights dimmed, Claire sat alone by the river behind the store. The sky blushed with late summer dusk, leaves rustled, and water moved like a quiet hymn. She thought of that woman. Of all the times she had questioned whether her life mattered, whether choosing kindness, choosing stillness, choosing love without applause was enough. And now, here she was, seen, read, understood. She whispered into the wind, not knowing who would hear, I don't need a million readers, just one heart that feels less alone. And the river, faithful as ever, carried her words away. The maple leaves had begun to turn, not yet the fire reds of late October, but the kind of golden blush that whispered of change. It was the kind of afternoon that wrapped around you like an old quilt, soft, familiar, and just a little worn at the edges. Along the quiet bend of the Maple River, under a small wooden arch draped in white linen and wildflowers, Claire Whitmore stood barefoot in the grass, her white dress brushing gently against her ankles. A simple crown of wild daisies circled her hair. Her eyes calm, but glowing were fixed on the man waiting just a few steps ahead. Grant Langston wore his father's old suit. It didn't quite fit around the shoulders, but neither of them cared. He'd never looked more like himself. No spotlights, no boardrooms, no audience, just a small gathering of souls who had seen them through the women from the bookstore. Grant's evening students, a few old neighbors, Marcy with her arm around her partner, and a pair of toddlers chasing butterflies between the folding chairs. No stage, no speeches, just the rustling trees, the sound of the river, and a softness in the air that felt like the world finally exhaling. There was no music. Claire had chosen instead to read. When she stepped forward, holding a small sheet of handmade paper, the crowd fell into gentle hush. Her voice, as always, wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. For years, I lived between commas, pausing, pleasing, proving, until a wrong number call became the sentence I finally wanted to finish. You were never punctuation. You were the point. Grant blinked slowly, lips pressed into a smile so tender it nearly broke her heart. There was no "I do" shouted into the wind, just two hands held, and a vow shared in the way their eyes stayed locked like a promise they'd already been living. After the ceremony, someone passed around cider in mason jars. Someone else brought a basket of warm cornbread. A dog barked in the distance, and a child giggled as her shoes sunk into the river mud. Claire and Grant sat quietly on the porch swing just outside the bookstore, watching the light stretch long across the river. Neither spoke for a while. They didn't need to. Sometimes the soul says more in stillness than the tongue ever could. Claire's bare feet swayed gently with the swing, her gown tucked under her legs. The wildflowers in her hair had begun to wilt a little, but somehow, that made her more radiant. Grant leaned back, one hand behind her, the other cradling his cider, thumb tracing the rim. The same thumb that once signed contracts, directed teams, ended deals. Now, it just traced slow circles, without urgency. He turned toward her, voice barely above a whisper. "You weren't just my secretary, Claire. You were the only part of my life that ever felt true." Claire didn't reply with words. She reached for his hand, lacing their fingers together the way she always did when something mattered more than she could say. The porch creaked gently beneath them. The air smelled of apples and worn wood. Someone inside the bookstore laughed a full, round laugh, and someone else turned on a soft jazz record, letting the notes float lazily through the open windows. It was all enough. Not dazzling, not extravagant, just true. Grant rested his head lightly against hers. Claire closed her eyes, breathing in the weight of everything they'd left behind: the boardrooms, the gossip, the lonely coffee mornings. She thought of the girl she once was. The one who'd scribbled dreams into journals and torn out the pages when the world told her she wasn't enough. That girl had survived, and somehow, along the way, she had bloomed, not loudly, but completely. As the sun dipped lower, Grant tilted his head slightly. "Did you ever think," he murmured, "that a life this quiet could feel this big?" Claire smiled. "All the best stories are quiet at the end," she replied, "but they echo." She leaned into him, resting her cheek against the fabric of his old suit jacket, her heartbeat steady and soft. The porch swing creaked again. A maple leaf fluttered down and landed on Grant's shoulder. Neither of them brushed it away. In that golden hush of a late September day, surrounded by nothing but trees, river, and the people who had truly seen them, Grant and Claire arrived at something rare, a love that asked for nothing flashy, a peace that didn't need to be earned, a full circle, not a perfect one, but a whole one. The book was modest, no gold foil title, no national tour, no spot on bestseller lists. Just a soft cover with a hand-drawn cover, a small desk, a cup of coffee, and an old leather-bound notebook sitting open beside a vase of wild daisies. Its title was simple: The Secretary's Secret. Claire hadn't written it for fame. She had written it to finally tell the truth, not just hers, but for every woman who had ever sat in the corner of a room, unnoticed, holding together lives, dreams, and love with quiet hands. The story had taken her nearly a year. She'd written it between shelving books, brewing tea, tending to the lives that passed through her store. Sometimes Grant would read her early drafts at night, pointing to a sentence and saying, "That one? That's you." When the book launched, it didn't explode. It rippled. A letter arrived from a woman in Montana. "I left my marriage after 27 years. Your book helped me remember I still have a voice." Another from a librarian in Georgia. "We're using your story in our weekly circle for widowed women. Thank you for reminding us we're more than what we've lost." It passed from hand to hand, wrapped in brown paper, underlined, dog-eared, reread aloud in living rooms. Claire had once feared no one would care, but they did. Not because the story was loud, but because it was true. One September afternoon, exactly 1 year after the book was published, Claire held a quiet gathering at the Quiet Chapter. It wasn't called a launch or a signing. She called it a story circle. The folding chairs came out again. The river breeze filtered through the windows. Marcy brought pies. Grant set up extra tables on the porch. They had expected 20. Over 100 showed up. Some came with their daughters, some came alone, some walked with canes. One woman had driven 3 hours with a folded blanket and a note that simply read, "Your book helped me get out of bed again." Claire didn't sit at a table with a pen, waiting for people to come to her. She moved among them. She held hands, took time, listened. One woman brought her own copy spine nearly falling apart with pages stained by tea and tears. "This chapter," she whispered. "This is me." Claire smiled gently. "Then it's yours now." At 3:00 p.m., someone tapped a glass gently, and the room quieted. Claire stood at the front, behind the worn wooden counter that had once held her own trembling hands when she first opened the shop. A copy of The Secretary's Secret lay before her. She flipped to the last page. Her voice was calm, low, but every word landed. He thought she was just his secretary, until the night she reminded him how to feel. She closed the book. For a long moment, there was only silence, then a single clap, then another, until the room pulsed with quiet, steady applause. But Claire didn't look at the clapping hands. She looked to the back of the room, where Grant stood, hands in his pockets, eyes soft, shoulders relaxed in that way they only ever were when she was near. He didn't smile broadly, he didn't try to stand out, but he held her gaze steady, open, full, like always. After the applause faded and the chairs began to empty, Claire stepped out onto the porch. The sun dipped low, casting golden light across the river. A few people lingered in small groups, sipping cider, sharing stories. Grant walked toward her, slow and unhurried. "You did it," he said softly. Claire looked out at the river, then back at him. "No," she replied. "We did." He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded note. "Found this in the back of your first draft," he said, handing it to her. It was a quote she'd scribbled on a napkin months ago. "The quiet ones aren't silent. They're writing the loudest truths." She smiled, holding it close to her chest. That night, after the last guest had gone and the last pie dish had been washed, Claire and Grant sat in the bookstore's reading nook, the same one where he'd first kissed her shoulder without a word. She leaned her head against him, pulling a blanket over their legs. "Do you ever wonder," she whispered, "what would have happened if you hadn't dialed the wrong number that night?" Grant chuckled. "I didn't." Claire pulled back slightly, eyes narrowing. "You what?" He looked at her, that same quiet grin dancing in his eyes. "I knew exactly who I was calling." She laughed a full, round laugh that echoed softly through the shelves. For the first time, she didn't just feel like she was in a story. She knew she had written one every page, every pause, every whispered hope, and now, finally, it was finished. Sometimes, the most powerful stories are the quietest ones. Claire and Grant's journey reminds us that love doesn't always arrive with grand gestures or dramatic moments. Often, it comes softly through shared silence, kind eyes, a hand reaching out when no one else is watching. We live in a world that often celebrates loud success and overlooks gentle souls. But this story teaches us that being seen, truly seen by just one person, can change everything. It's never too late to start again. Whether it's picking up an old dream, leaving a place that no longer fits, or allowing ourselves to be loved, the way we deserve life continues to offer second beginnings. For those who feel invisible, forgotten, or too ordinary, this is your reminder. You matter. Your voice matters. And your story isn't over. Healing takes time, but peace, when it comes, is worth every step. Thank you for spending your precious time with us today. If this story touched your heart, please consider giving it a like, sharing it with someone who needs a little hope, and subscribing to our channel for more gentle, soul-stirring stories. Your support helps us keep telling the stories that often go unheard but never unneeded. We're grateful you're here.